My parents tried to call me. After I spent 8 years managing their polyamorous relationships like a full-time job, when I finally opened up about the abuse, my mom laughed and said, "You were never special. You were just convenient." I just stared at her. That was 3 months ago. Yesterday, she saw something on her phone, went completely still, and hasn't eaten. Since how involved were you in your parents' love life? When I was 8 years old, my parents made me their relationship manager because they said their polyamorous lifestyle was too complex for them to handle without a neutral mediator. My parents discovered polyamory when I was 7 and immediately dove into multiple relationships. Within months, they each had 3 partners who had partners of their own. They decided I was perfect to manage it all because children were naturally unbiased. What they really meant was they needed someone to blame when jealousy erupted, because my job started simple enough, keeping a calendar of who spent which nights where, but it quickly expanded to mediating fights, scheduling dates, and making sure no one felt neglected. By the time I was 9, I was facilitating relationship check-ins and taking notes on everyone's emotional needs. Mom would wake me at midnight crying because Dad spent an extra hour with his partner. Dad would rage when Mom's girlfriend took her somewhere special. When conflicts arose, both parents would summon me to mediate, each secretly instructing me to take their side. I'd sit between angry adults trying to negotiate boundaries while they screamed over my head about needs I couldn't understand. The worst was when relationships ended. Mom's boyfriend left after 6 months saying the dynamic was toxic. My parents blamed me for not scheduling enough quality time. When Dad's girlfriend broke up with him, they said I'd failed to remind him about their anniversary. Every breakup became my fault. They'd ground me for weeks as punishment for losing them partners. When I was 11, the entire polycule imploded over a vacation. I'd supposedly failed to coordinate properly. 7 adults stood in our living room screaming while I sat with my laptop frantically pulling up emails to prove I'd sent the right information. By the time I was 13, I was managing 12 different relationships, including their partners. Other partners because my parents got them to agree that that was the only way things would be fair. I had a phone specifically for relationship emergencies that rang constantly. During school, I'd get texts about conflicts needing immediate resolution. I'd hide in bathroom stalls, mediating breakups between adults who couldn't communicate without a teenager translating. My own friendships withered because I was always on call. When I tried to quit, my parents said I was being selfish and threatened to kick me out. "This family only works because of your gift," they said. "Without you, we'd lose everyone we love." But then Mom started dating Chris, who hated the child manager system. He refused to go through me for scheduling and called it child abuse to my face. Mom was infatuated and began skipping other relationships for him, destroying the balance I'd maintained for years. Her partners complained to me, sending angry texts demanding their scheduled time, but Mom accused me of jealousy and sabotage. Meanwhile, Dad started dating someone who found the system creepy and convinced him to abandon scheduling altogether. Within weeks, their network was in chaos. Partners showed up on wrong nights, raging about unfair distribution of time. My parents had me organize a relationship weekend as a last-ditch effort to salvage things and convinced all their parents to go along with it. It was an absolute disaster. Mom's girlfriend showed up mad because she discovered Dad had put a GPS tracker on her car. Somehow that made Dad's girlfriend realize Mom had been manipulating the system to isolate her. Years of resentment erupted at once, but then the blame shifted entirely to me. How had I allowed these deceptions? Why hadn't I flagged suspicious patterns? I was 16 watching adults destroy each other over a system I'd never wanted to manage. When the screaming stopped, they'd lost every partner except each other, and they blamed me for all of it. That night, my parents' rage turned into something darker. They'd lost everyone they loved because of my incompetence, and now they were stuck with just each other. And the child who'd ruined everything, Mom started drinking heavily, while Dad paced the living room, both of them listing every partner I'd cost them, every happiness I'd stolen. They fed off each other's anger until Mom suddenly stopped mid-sentence and looked at Dad. "She has all the evidence," she said quietly. "Years of emails, texts, recordings from the mediation sessions. She knows everything we've done to each other." Dad's face went pale as he realized what she meant. I documented everything on the laptop they'd given me. Every lie, every manipulation, every time one of them had sabotaged the other. I knew which partners they'd cheated with, which boundaries they'd violated, which crimes they'd committed in the name of love. They turned to me in unison, and I saw the decision in their eyes before they even moved. I ran for my room, but Dad got there first, blocking the door, while Mom grabbed my laptop from the kitchen. "We're going to fix this," she said, her voice slurring but determined. "All of it tonight." They started destroying everything: my laptop, my phone, the backup drives I'd hidden, but I knew they wouldn't stop there. The real evidence was in my head. I was the only witness to 8 years of their toxic games. As they cornered me in the hallway, Dad holding the hammer he'd used on my laptop, I realized they'd finally found something they could agree on. The child who knew too much had to go. I dropped to the floor and rolled under the dining table as Dad swung the hammer where my head had been. Mom lunged after me, knocking over chairs. My hands found the table leg, and I used it to propel myself out the other side, scrambling toward the back door. Dad cut me off, hurting me toward the living room while Mom blocked the front entrance. They moved with the same coordination they'd never managed in their relationships. 8 years of failed communication suddenly crystallized into wordless understanding. Mom grabbed the fireplace poker while Dad positioned himself between me and the stairs. I backed against the wall, calculating distances and exits. The laptop they destroyed held copies, but the originals lived on a cloud server they didn't know about. Every mediation session I'd recorded, every manipulative text they'd sent through me, every partner they'd played against each other. The evidence that could destroy them both in divorce court, custody hearings, or worse. Mom stepped closer, poker raised. I ducked left, and she anticipated it, driving me toward Dad. His hand caught my shoulder, and I twisted away, but not before seeing the calculation in his eyes. They weren't just angry anymore. They were planning. I made it 3 steps toward the kitchen before Dad tackled me. We hit the floor hard, my elbow cracking against hardwood. Mom's hands found my throat while Dad pinned my arms. The room spun as oxygen became precious. Through the haze, I heard them arguing about methods, about evidence, about making things look accidental. My knee found Dad's stomach, and he loosened his grip enough for me to wrench one arm free. I clawed at Mom's face, and she jerked back, giving me the second I needed to roll sideways and kick Dad's shin. They both grabbed for me, but I was already moving, adrenaline overriding the pain in my elbow. The kitchen offered weapons, but no exits. I grabbed the first thing I touched, a ceramic mug, and hurled it at Dad's head. He dodged, but it bought me time to reach the knife block. Mom screamed at him to stop me. My fingers closed on a handle just as Dad's hand covered mine. We struggled for the knife while Mom circled behind me. Dad's superior strength started winning, bending my wrist back. I let go suddenly, and he stumbled backward, giving me space to grab a cast iron pan. Mom rushed me, and I swung it in a wide arc, catching her hip. She went down cursing. Dad came at me again, more cautious now. I backed toward the pantry, pan raised. He feinted left, and I swung, but he was ready, catching my wrist and twisting until I dropped the pan. It clanged against tile as he shoved me into the pantry shelves. Cans tumbled around us. Mom limped over, favoring her bruised hip. They exchanged a look that said everything. No more playing around, no more mistakes. I was trapped between them and shelves of food, nowhere left to run. That's when I remembered the panic button. 3 months ago, after a particularly violent fight between Mom's partners, I'd installed a silent alarm app on my phone. One press sent my location and an emergency message to 3 trusted contacts: my English teacher, Ms. Starr, our neighbor, Mrs. Carter, and my best friend's mom, who was a nurse. I'd tested it once, apologizing profusely for the false alarm. The phone was in my back pocket. Dad grabbed my shoulders, spinning me to face him while Mom approached with zip zip ties she'd found in the junk drawer. I let them think I was defeated, going limp in Dad's grip. My right hand slipped behind me, finding the phone muscle memory, guiding my thumb to the power button. 5 rapid presses, the emergency shortcut I'd programmed. Mom started on my wrists while Dad held me still. The zip tie bit into skin as she pulled it tight. I kept my face blank, not letting them see the hope blooming in my chest. The app would send my GPS location, a recording from the phone's microphone, and a preset message: parents attacking me. Please call 911. They marched me back to the living room, discussing their next moves in the coded language they developed over years of polyamory. Mom mentioned cleaning up loose ends while Dad talked about restructuring foundations. I knew what they meant: make me disappear, then craft a story about a troubled teen who ran away. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a response to the panic alert. They didn't notice, too focused on their planning. I'm trying to understand how an 8-year-old could manage 12 adult relationships when most kids that age can barely organize their own homework. The way they made this kid track everyone's schedules and feelings is making me wonder what kind of spreadsheets they had. Mom retrieved her laptop from their bedroom while Dad watched me, hammer still in hand. They'd need to destroy my cloud access, delete my social media, create a false trail. All things I could help with if properly motivated. The doorbell rang. We all froze. Mom and Dad exchanged panicked looks. It rang again, followed by knocking. A voice called out, "Mrs. Carter, our neighbor." "Hello," I heard screaming. "Is everything okay?" Dad's hand covered my mouth before I could respond. Mom crept to the window, peering through blinds. She held up 3 fingers. 3 people outside. My panic alert had worked better than I'd hoped. More knocking, harder now. Another voice: "Miss Starr, we're not leaving until someone answers." "We've already called for help." The beautiful words hung in the air. Already called for help. Mom's face went white. Dad's grip on me loosened as sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. They had minutes, maybe less, before their whole world imploded. Dad released me and stepped back, his face cycling through emotions. Mom dropped the laptop, hands shaking. The sirens were distinct now. Multiple vehicles. I watched my parents realize their coordination had come too late. 8 years of toxic games, and they'd finally work together only to destroy themselves. The pounding on the door intensified. "Police, open up." Mom looked at me, tears streaming. Not tears of remorse, tears of rage at being caught. Dad set the hammer on the coffee table with exaggerated care, as if that would erase the last hour. They moved apart, instinctively creating distance, already crafting individual defenses. I walked to the door, zip ties still cutting into my wrists, and opened it with my bound hands. 3 police officers stood there, hands on weapons. Behind them, Mrs. Carter clutched her phone. Miss Starr looked terrified but determined, and my friend's mom was already pushing forward with her medical bag. "They tried to KLL me," I said clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear, "because I have evidence of child abuse going back 8 years. The officers entered fast, separating my parents' reading rights. Mom started her performance, immediately confused, concerned, claiming I'd had an episode. Dad went silent, calculating odds, but I saw the defeat in their eyes. They'd spent years manipulating partners, but they couldn't manipulate zip ties on my wrists, bruises on my neck, or 3 witnesses who'd heard the commotion. As paramedics checked my injuries and officers took photos, I thought about the irony. My parents had made me an expert in managing complex relationships, documenting everything, understanding human dynamics. They'd trained me to survive them. Miss Starr sat beside me in the ambulance, holding my hand after they cut the zip ties. "Your message said you had evidence." I nodded. 8 years of recordings, emails, texts, every partner they manipulated, every lie they told, every time they made me cover for them. It's all in the cloud. She squeezed my hand. "You're safe now." But I knew better. This was just the beginning. There would be court dates, custody hearings, trauma therapy. My parents would hire lawyers, craft narratives, try to paint me as disturbed. The evidence would be questioned, my motives examined, my entire life dissected. Still, as the ambulance pulled away, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 8 years. Hope. The house grew smaller in the back window, my parents invisible behind walls and police tape. They'd created their own prison built from jealousy and manipulation and locked themselves inside. I closed my eyes and let the sirens sing me toward whatever came next. For the first time since I was 7 years old, I wasn't managing anyone else's relationships. I was finally free to figure out my own. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and floor wax. A social worker named Emily sat across from me, notepad balanced on her knee, while a detective reviewed my initial statement. They'd been gentle but thorough, photographing every bruise, documenting each injury. The zip tie marks on my wrist looked angry under fluorescent lights. "The cloud storage you mentioned," the detective said. "Well, need access to verify your claims." I gave them the login information, watching Emily's face as she scrolled through years of evidence on her tablet. Her expression shifted from professional neutrality to barely concealed horror. The detective leaned over her shoulder, pointing at specific files. "This is extensive," Emily said finally. "How long have you been documenting?" "Since I was 9. They told me keeping records would help me manage things better." The detective pulled up a chair. "Can you walk us through the recording system?" I explained how I'd started with simple notes, then graduated to audio recordings when mediation sessions grew violent. How I'd learned to back up everything after Mom deleted files in a rage. How I'd created hidden folders labeled as homework to store the worst evidence. Emily found the folder labeled Math Project 2019. Her hand covered her mouth as audio played Mom screaming at Dad's partner, while I tried to mediate, my 11-year-old voice shaking as I attempted to calm adults who wanted to hurt each other. The detective's jaw tightened. They asked about specific incidents, cross-referencing my statements with the digital evidence. Each file told a story of escalation of boundaries, pushed and broken, of a child forced into an impossible role. The recordings were damning, not just of abuse, but of the systematic destruction of my childhood. "This one," Emily said, showing me a video file. "When was this taken?" I recognized it immediately. Mom's birthday party 2 years ago. I'd hidden my phone behind a vase recording as she berated me for scheduling conflicts while her partners watched. The video showed her grabbing my arm, shaking me while Dad told me I was ruining everything. None of the other adults intervened. That was the night I realized none of them would help me. I said they all benefited from the system. The detective made notes about each adult in the video, getting names and relationships. The polyamory network that had seemed so complex to manage now looked like what it was: a web of complicit adults who'd watched a child suffer and done nothing. Emily closed the tablet, her face pale. "You've been incredibly brave documenting all this. But I need to ask, why didn't you tell anyone sooner?" It was the question I dreaded. How to explain the gradual normalization of abuse, the way they'd isolated me from other adults who might have helped, the threats disguised as love. They said I was special. I told her that I had a gift for managing relationships, that without me our family would fall apart. And they were right. When I stopped being perfect at it, everything did fall apart. "That wasn't your responsibility," Emily said firmly. "None of this was, but knowing that and feeling it were different things. 8 years of conditioning didn't disappear with a few hours of freedom." The detective's phone rang, interrupting Emily's reassurances. He stepped into the hallway to answer while Emily continued reviewing files. I watched her face change as she discovered the folder I'd labeled Emergency Protocols, detailed notes about each parent's triggers, manipulation tactics, and the escalation patterns I'd observed over 8 years. Emily's tablet buzzed with an incoming message. Her expression darkened as she read it. The detective returned, his jaw set in a hard line. They exchanged glances that made my stomach drop. The detective sat down heavily. He explained that my parents had already contacted their lawyer, a family friend who'd been part of their polyamory network. They were claiming it suffered a psychotic break, that it attacked them unprovoked. The lawyer was pushing for for my immediate psychiatric evaluation. My hands started shaking. I knew this pattern. When cornered, my parents always flipped the narrative. They'd done it with every partner who tried to leave painting them as unstable, jealous, or delusional. Now they were using the same playbook on me. Emily pulled up more files, her fingers flying across the screen. She found the audio recordings from 3 years ago, when Mom had convinced Dad's partner she was losing her mind, gaslighting her so effectively that the woman had checked herself into therapy. The parallels were undeniable. The detective made calls while Emily documented everything. I provided passwords to additional cloud accounts, email archives dating back years. Each revelation painted a clearer picture of systematic abuse hidden behind the facade of an alternative lifestyle. A nurse entered to check my vitals. She frowned at my elevated heart rate the way I flinched when she touched my wrist. Emily showed her the photos of my injuries. The nurse's professional mask slipped, revealing disgust. The detective returned with news that made everything worse. My parents' lawyer had filed an emergency motion claiming I was a danger to myself. They wanted me placed in psychiatric hold while they pursued conservatorship. If successful, they'd control my medical decisions, my finances, my freedom. Emily immediately called her supervisor. I listened to her argue, her voice rising as she described the evidence. The supervisor wanted to follow protocol, wait for the full investigation. Emily slammed her hand on the table, making me jump. The detective suggested moving me to a secure location. Not psychiatric, a safe house for endangered youth, but that required paperwork approvals, time we didn't have. My parents knew the system better than most. They'd spent years manipulating relationship dynamics. Navigating legal loopholes would be child's play. Emily made more calls, pulling in favors. She found a judge willing to review the evidence immediately. Talk about perfect timing with those sirens. The parents finally learned to work together just in time to coordinate their own downfall, which is some seriously poetic justice right there. We had 2 hours to compile everything into a coherent presentation. 2 hours to prove 8 years of abuse before my parents could lock me away. I worked with shaking hands, organizing files chronologically. Each folder told part of the story. The progression from simple scheduling to complex manipulation. The escalation from emotional neglect to physical violence. The systematic destruction of my autonomy. Emily printed key documents while the detective created a timeline. They worked with the efficiency of professionals who'd seen too much, but I caught the horror in their eyes. Some recordings were too disturbing to play in full, some photos too damning to ignore. An hour in, Emily's phone rang. My parents had arrived at the hospital with their lawyer. They were demanding to see me, claiming parental rights. Security was holding them in the lobby, but the lawyer was pushing hard. The detective positioned himself by the door while Emily and I worked faster. She helped me write a statement, my hands too unsteady to type properly. Every word mattered. Every detail could be the difference between freedom and captivity. We finished with minutes to spare. Emily grabbed the compiled evidence while the detective coordinated our exit. They wrapped me in a hospital blanket, hiding my face as we moved through back corridors. I heard Mom's voice echoing from the main lobby, playing the worried parent perfectly. The courthouse was a blur of security checks and sterile hallways. The judge, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, reviewed our emergency petition in chambers. Emily presented the evidence methodically, while I sat silent, the blanket still around my shoulders. The judge's expression grew darker with each file she reviewed. She asked pointed questions about the timeline, the documentation methods, the patterns of abuse. When she played an audio recording of Mom threatening to have me committed if I didn't comply with the relationship management, her pen snapped in half. My parents' lawyer arrived as we were finishing. He tried to enter chambers, but the judge refused. Through the door, I heard him arguing about parental rights, about my supposed mental instability. The judge cut him off with a single word. She issued a temporary restraining order on the spot. My parents couldn't come within 500 feet of me. She also ordered an expedited investigation into the abuse allegations and blocked any attempts at psychiatric hold without her explicit approval. Emily's shoulders sagged with relief. The detective allowed himself a small smile, but I knew my parents too well. This was just the first battle in what would be a long war. We left through a different exit, the detective's hand on his weapon. A safe house had been arranged, a nondescript apartment building 40 minutes away. Emily would stay with me for the first night while they processed the paperwork for a more permanent solution. The apartment was small but secure. Multiple locks, security cameras, panic buttons in every room. Emily showed me around while the detective checked the perimeter. I collapsed on the narrow bed, exhaustion hitting like a physical weight. Emily made soup while I showered, washing away the hospital smell. The hot water stung my injuries, but I didn't care. For the first time in 8 years, I was alone with my thoughts without fearing interruption. When I emerged, Emily had set up a laptop. She explained that we needed to preserve all evidence in multiple locations. My parents would try to discredit or destroy whatever they could access. We spent hours creating backups, encrypting files, establishing secure communication channels. The detective returned with updates. My parents had been arrested after attempting to break into my old school, searching for any records they could use against me. They'd been released on bail, but the restraining order violations were adding up. Emily received a call that changed everything. A former partner of Mom's had seen news of the arrests. She wanted to come forward with her own evidence. Within hours, 3 more former partners had contacted the detective. The web of abuse extended far beyond just me. Each testimony revealed new horrors. The partner Mom had gaslit into therapy. The one Dad had financially ruined through legal manipulation. The couple they'd turned against each other for sport. All of them had evidence, texts, emails, recordings they'd kept out of paranoia or spite. The detective coordinated interviews while Emily helped me process what was happening. My parents had created dozens of victims over the years. I was just the youngest, the one they'd groomed from childhood to enable their behavior. By morning, the case had exploded beyond family court. The district attorney was involved, building charges for child abuse, domestic violence, fraud. The polyamory community my parents had infiltrated was cooperating, fully horrified that predators had used their lifestyle as cover. Emily fielded calls from reporters who'd gotten wind of the story. She declined all interviews focusing on protecting my privacy, but my parents had no such restraint. Their lawyer held a press conference painting them as victims of a troubled teen and vindictive ex-partners. The smear campaign was predictable but effective. Social media lit up with debates about polyamory, parenting, mental health. My parents positioned themselves as pioneers persecuted for their lifestyle choices. They claimed I'd been brainwashed by conservative influences at school. Emily showed me how to avoid the coverage, but curiosity won. I found my mother's tearful interview, my father's stoic defense. They'd crafted a narrative where they were loving parents destroyed by a child's rebellion. It was masterful manipulation, exactly what it expected. The safe house felt smaller as the days passed. Emily was replaced by rotating social workers, all kind but overwhelmed. The detective visited daily with updates. More victims came forward, the evidence mounted. But my parents' lawyer was good finding technicalities and loopholes. A week in, I received a package. The social worker on duty checked it carefully. Photos from my childhood, happy family portraits that told a different story. My parents at my school plays birthday parties, family vacations, evidence of their loving parenting. The message was clear. They had their own documentation. Years of photos showing a normal family. They'd been building their defense as long as I'd been building mine. Every public appearance, every social media post had been crafted to support their eventual narrative. Emily returned with concerning news. My parents had hired a private investigator to dig into the backgrounds of everyone supporting me. Miss Starr had received threatening calls. Mrs. Carter found her car vandalized. My friend's mother discovered someone had been asking questions about her at work. The intimidation campaign was subtle but effective. One by one, witnesses grew reluctant. Not everyone could afford the scrutiny my parents were bringing. The detective assured assured me the core evidence was enough, but I saw the worry in his eyes. Then came the breakthrough. Emily found a pattern in the financial records. My parents had been embezzling from their partners for years, using the complex relationship dynamics to hide money transfers. What started as child abuse charges was becoming a federal case. The FBI got involved following the money trail. They found offshore accounts, tax fraud, identity theft. My parents had used their partner's information to open credit cards, take out loans. The same manipulation tactics they'd used emotionally had been applied financially. My parents' lawyer abandoned them when the federal charges were filed. No amount of spin could explain away the financial crimes. They hired new representation, but the damage was done. Their carefully crafted image was crumbling. The safe house routines became familiar. Morning check-ins with Emily, afternoon sessions with a trauma therapist, evening calls with the detective. I did schoolwork online trying to maintain some normalcy while my life exploded around me. 3 weeks after the initial incident, I testified before a grand jury. The prosecutor walked me through my evidence piece by piece. The jury's faces went from skeptical to horrified as they reviewed 8 years of documentation. Several members were crying by the end. My parents were indicted on 47 charges: child abuse, domestic violence, fraud, conspiracy. Their photos appeared in newspapers next to articles about the polyamory house of horrors. The same media they tried to manipulate turned on them viciously, but they weren't done fighting. From jail, they coordinated with remaining allies, former partners who still believed their lies, friends who'd only seen the public facade. These people launched their own campaign, claiming the investigation was biased, the evidence fabricated. Emily helped me understand that this was typical. Abusers often maintained loyal followers who couldn't accept the truth. These people attacked me online, calling me a liar, a homewrecker, a disturbed child seeking attention. Their words stung even though I knew better. The prosecutor warned that the trial would be brutal. My parents knew lawyers would attack my credibility, my mental health, my motives. They'd try to turn 8 years of evidence into the delusions of a troubled teenager. I had to be prepared for the worst. Emily arranged for me to meet with other survivors of parental abuse. Their stories differed in details but shared common themes: the gaslighting, the isolation, the way love became a weapon. They'd survived their trials and built new lives. It was possible. As the trial date approached, my parents made one last desperate move. They offered a plea deal. They'd admit to minor charges if I agreed to sealed records and no further contact. It was tempting. How did they manage to coordinate all those attacks from jail? Does the system really let people do that much damage while locked up? A quiet end to the nightmare. No public trial, no cross-examination, no media circus. But I thought about their other victims, the partners they destroyed who deserved justice, the future victims if they remained free. Emily supported whatever decision I made, but I saw the hope in her eyes when I refused the deal. The night before the trial, I couldn't sleep. Emily stayed up with me reviewing testimony one last time. She reminded me that truth was powerful, that my 8 years of documentation would speak louder than any lie my parents could tell. As dawn broke, I stood at the safe house window watching the city wake up. Somewhere out there, my parents were preparing their defense, still believing they could manipulate their way to freedom. They taught me everything about managing complex relationships, documenting truth, understanding human nature. Now I would use every lesson against them. The trial started in 3 hours. Emily arrived early with a change of clothes and breakfast I couldn't eat. My stomach churned as she helped me prepare, adjusting my collar with steady hands while mine trembled. The prosecutor had warned me about their tactics. My parents' lawyers would try to break me, make me seem unstable, turn my evidence into delusions. The courthouse steps felt endless. Emily walked beside me while the detective flanked my other side, both watching for any sign of my parents, despite the restraining order. Inside the hallways buzzed with activity. Other cases, other lives being decided. Mine was just one of many. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Wood paneling, uncomfortable benches, a judge's bench that seemed to loom over everything. The prosecutor nodded as we entered, gesturing to seats behind her table. Across the aisle, my parents' legal team was already assembled, 3 lawyers in expensive suits, briefcases full of whatever narrative they'd crafted. Then I saw them, mom and dad, dressed conservatively, looking nothing like the people who tried to kill me weeks ago. Mom had styled her hair differently, applied makeup to look fragile and maternal. Dad wore glasses I'd never seen before, softening his appearance. They'd transformed themselves into the victims they claimed to be. The judge entered and everyone rose. She was different from the one who'd issued the restraining order. A middle-aged man with tired eyes who'd probably seen too many family disputes. The prosecutor had warned me about him too. Fair but traditional, skeptical of unusual family arrangements, likely to view polyamory with suspicion. Opening statements began. The prosecutor laid out the case methodically. 8 years of documented abuse, escalating violence, the attempt on my life. She played select recordings, showed photos of my injuries, presented the timeline Emily and the detective had constructed. The evidence was overwhelming, but I watched the jury's faces. Some looked horrified. Others seemed confused by the polyamory aspect, unable to separate lifestyle from abuse. My parents' lead lawyer stood with practiced confidence. He painted a picture. I'd expected loving parents trying to navigate an alternative lifestyle. A troubled teenager who'd resented their choices. A child who'd manipulated recordings and fabricated evidence out of jealousy. He suggested I'd hurt myself for attention, that the attack was actually my parents trying to restrain me during a mental health crisis. The first witnesses were the responding officers. They described the scene clinically. My injuries, my parents' demeanor, the destroyed electronics. The defense lawyer questioned their bias, suggested they'd made assumptions based on the unusual family structure. One officer wavered, admitting he'd found the polyamory concerning. Regardless of the abuse allegations, Mrs. Carter testified next, describing the sounds she'd heard, her decision to respond to my emergency alert. The defense painted her as a nosy neighbor who'd always disapproved of my parents' lifestyle. They brought up a noise complaint she'd filed 2 years ago, suggesting a pattern of harassment. Ms. Starr's testimony was stronger. She described changes in my behavior over the years, my exhaustion, the times I'd fallen asleep in class after late-night mediation sessions. But the defense had done their homework. They'd found a blog post where she'd written about supporting LGBTQ students and twisted it to suggest she'd encouraged me to rebel against my parents' unconventional relationship structure. The medical examiner presented my injuries in detail. The zip tie marks, bruising patterns, defensive wounds. The defense's medical expert countered with alternative explanations. Self-inflicted injuries, marks consistent with restraint during a psychological episode. They battled with medical jargon while I sat frozen, reliving every moment. Emily testified about the evidence review, the patterns of abuse she'd identified. The defense attacked her credentials, her experience with polyamorous families, her rush to judgment. They suggested she'd been biased by her own traditional values, unable to understand alternative family structures. Former partners began testifying on day 3. The woman mom had gaslighted broke down describing her experience, but the defense portrayed her as a jealous ex trying to destroy a family dad's former partner who'd been financially ruined, face aggressive cross-examination about his own financial troubles. The lawyer suggesting he'd blamed my parents for his own failures. Each witness faced the same treatment. Their pain was minimized, their motives questioned, their credibility attacked. The defense wove a narrative where everyone was lying, conspiring, misunderstanding, where my parents were pioneers persecuted for their choices. On day 5, I took the stand. The prosecutor walked me through my story chronologically. I described starting as a relationship manager at 8, the escalating responsibilities, the blame for every failed relationship. I detailed the night they'd attacked me, speaking clearly despite my shaking hands. She introduced evidence, methodically recordings, emails, the cloud storage they'd they tried to destroy. Cross-examination was brutal. The lead defense lawyer smiled kindly while shredding my credibility. He questioned my memory, suggested I'd misinterpreted normal parental guidance as abuse. He played recordings out of context, making mediation sessions sound like family meetings. He brought up my grades, my lack of friends, painting me as an antisocial teen who'd blamed parents for my own failures. He introduced their evidence, the happy family photos, school records showing parental involvement, testimonials from family friends who'd never seen abuse. He suggested I'd been influenced by conservative teachers, by friends who didn't understand polyamory, by online forums that demonize alternative lifestyles. The worst part was when he played a recording. I'd never heard my own voice at age 10, talking to a school counselor about feeling special, being trusted with adult responsibilities. They'd twisted my conditioned responses into evidence of a happy childhood. I stayed calm, answering each question honestly. When he suggested I'd fabricated evidence, I explained the date stamps, the metadata, the impossibility of faking 8 years of documentation. When he accused me of jealousy, I described the exhaustion of managing 12 relationships while my own friendships died. When he painted my parents as loving, I pointed to the zip tie marks permanently scarred into my wrists. The prosecutor's redirect gave me space to clarify, to provide context the defense had stripped away. But damage was done. I saw doubt in some jurors. Eyes the confusion between lifestyle and abuse the defense had cultivated. Mom testified next, playing the martyred mother perfectly. She cried about losing her baby to prejudice, about trying to raise me with open values in a closed-minded world. She admitted to mistakes but painted them as parenting struggles, not abuse. She claimed the night of the attack was a mental health intervention, that they'd been trying to save me from myself. Dad's testimony was more controlled. He portrayed himself as a father who tried to balance unconventional choices with traditional parenting. He expressed regret about involving me in relationship management, but framed it as a misguided attempt at transparency. He claimed I'd volunteered, wanted to help, enjoyed the responsibility, until teenage rebellion hit. The defense brought character witnesses, friends who'd attended dinners, teachers who'd seen involved parents, neighbors who'd noticed nothing unusual. Each testified to my parents' loving nature, their community involvement, their dedication to family, but the prosecutor had saved crucial evidence. She introduced the financial crimes, the FBI's findings, the pattern of exploitation beyond just me. The defense objected, arguing relevance, but the judge allowed it. The jury saw how my parents had used the same manipulation tactics financially that they'd used emotionally. More former partners testified, describing financial exploitation alongside emotional abuse. The pattern became undeniable, my parents as predators using polyamory as cover, not pioneers of alternative lifestyles. The defense fought hard, but the evidence mounted. On day 8, closing arguments began. The defense made their final push, painting me as a confused teenager who'd misunderstood unconventional parenting, my parents as victims of a witch hunt. They asked the jury to see past prejudice, to recognize that different didn't mean abusive. The prosecutor's closing was methodical. She walked through 8 years of evidence, the escalation of abuse the night they tried to KLL me. She distinguished between polyamory and exploitation, between alternative lifestyles and child abuse. The defense team really went for the everyone's lying, except us strategy bold move when facing 8 years of receipts and zip tie scars that tell a different story entirely. She reminded the jury that my parents had made me responsible for adult relationships before I could tie my shoes. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Emily stayed with me in a witness room playing cards to pass time while my future was decided. The detective checked in regularly, assuring me the evidence was strong, but I knew how persuasive my parents could be, how easily they twisted reality. When the verdict came, my legs barely carried me back to the courtroom. The judge read each count while I gripped Emily's hand. Guilty of child abuse, guilty of domestic violence, guilty of assault, guilty of conspiracy, count after count. Guilty verdicts fell like dominoes. Mom collapsed, sobbing. Not tears of remorse, but rage at losing control. Dad sat stone-faced, still calculating, still planning. Their lawyers immediately mentioned appeals, but the judge wasn't finished. Sentencing would come later, but the judge revoked bail based on the guilty verdicts. Court officers approached my parents with handcuffs. Mom fought them, screaming about injustice about her baby. Dad submitted quietly, his eyes finding mine across the courtroom. In them, I saw the same calculation from the night he'd held the hammer. This wasn't over for him. As they led my parents away, something inside me shifted. 8 years of carrying their burdens, their lies, their toxic games, the weight began to lift. I wasn't their relationship manager anymore. I wasn't their scapegoat. I was just a teenager who'd survived. Outside the courthouse, Emily hugged me while reporters shouted questions we ignored. The detective drove us away from the chaos, back to the safe house that had become my temporary home. There would be sentencing hearings, appeals, ongoing therapy. The trauma wouldn't disappear with guilty verdicts. But that night, I slept without nightmares, without emergency phones ringing, without mediating adult conflicts. The silence felt foreign after 8 years of chaos, but I knew I'd learned to fill it with my own choices, my own relationships, my own life. My parents had taught me to document everything, understand human nature, navigate complex dynamics. They'd created their perfect victim, then trained me with every skill I'd need to escape them. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I was too tired for satisfaction. Emily made tea while I sat at the kitchen table processing what came next. Foster care until 18, continued therapy, finishing school, building friendships without fearing interruption, learning what relationships looked like without manipulation. It would take time, but time was finally mine. The system my parents had forced me to create had collapsed, taking them with it. Now I could build something new, something healthy, something entirely my own. Appreciate you sticking around and just vibing with me through all these questions. I had a blast thinking out loud with you. Alright, that's it for now. Catch you next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.